The Royal Sentinel Incident. First part. The summer heat in London was unbearable that Tuesday afternoon. Tourists crowded around Buckingham Palace like bees around honey, their cameras clicking constantly at the famous red-uniformed guards standing perfectly still at their posts. Among the sea of visitors, a group of college students from Manchester had arrived on their weekend trip to the capital. James Mitchell, 22 years old, with messy brown hair and bloodshot eyes, stumbled through the crowd carrying his fourth beer of the day. His friends had warned him to slow down, but James was celebrating his recent graduation and felt invincible. The cheap lager sloshed in the brown bottle as he pushed past families taking photos and street performers entertaining children. Standing at his post near the palace gates was Guardsman Thomas Webb, a 28-year-old soldier with 5 years of service in the Coldstream Guards. His tall black bearskin hat added to his imposing 6-foot frame, and his red tunic was perfectly pressed, despite the sweltering heat. Thomas had been standing motionless for nearly an hour, his face showing no emotion as hundreds of tourists snapped pictures and made jokes around him. The tradition of the Queen's Guard was sacred to Thomas. He understood that tourists found the guards amusing, but he took his duty seriously. Each day, he stood watch over the royal residence, protecting the monarchy and upholding centuries of British tradition. The stillness required incredible discipline, something Thomas had mastered through years of training and service. James, however, saw the guard differently. The alcohol had clouded his judgment, and he viewed Thomas as nothing more than a tourist attraction, a living statue put there for his entertainment. He nudged his friend Alex, a skinny redhead with freckles covering his face. "Watch this," James slurred, his words barely understandable. "I bet I can make that robot move." Alex shook his head nervously. "Come on, mate, leave him alone. We're supposed to meet the girls at the London Eye in an hour." But James was already walking toward Thomas, his beer bottle swinging carelessly in his hand. The crowd around them began to notice something was happening. A few people pulled out their phones, sensing drama was about to unfold. Thomas noticed the drunk tourist approaching, but maintained his composure. He had dealt with countless troublemakers during his service. Most would get bored and walk away when they realized the guards would not react to their antics. His training had taught him to ignore verbal abuse, inappropriate touching, and even minor physical provocations. James stopped directly in front of Thomas, so close that the guard could smell the alcohol on his breath. The young man's eyes were glazed over, and his speech was becoming more slurred with each word. "Hey there, tin soldier," James called out loudly, drawing more attention from nearby tourists. "Can you hear me in there? Or are you just a wax figure?" Several tourists began recording with their phones. A Japanese family with 2 young children moved away from the scene, sensing trouble brewing. An elderly American couple watched with concern, whispering to each other about calling security. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Years of training had prepared him for situations like this. He knew that breaking his stance would not only compromise his duty, but could also escalate the situation dangerously. James grew frustrated with the lack of response. The alcohol had made him aggressive, and he felt embarrassed that his friends and the growing crowd were watching his failed attempt to provoke the guard. He took another long drink from his beer bottle, finishing the contents in one gulp. "You think you're better than us?" James shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "Standing there all high and mighty in your fancy costume? You're nothing but a bloody tourist attraction." A police officer stationed near the palace began walking in their direction, but the crowd was thick, and it would take him several minutes to reach the scene. Thomas could see the officer approaching in his peripheral vision, but knew he had to handle the situation according to protocol until help arrived. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, all watching the confrontation unfold. Most were horrified by James's behavior, but a few seemed entertained by the drama. Children hid behind their parents while teenagers recorded everything on their smartphones. James's friend Alex tried one more time to intervene. He grabbed James by the shoulder and attempted to pull him away from the guard. "Come on, James, you've had enough. Let's go get some food and sober up before we get in real trouble." James shrugged off his friend's hand violently. "Get off me. I'm just having a bit of fun with our silent friend here." He turned back to Thomas with a menacing grin. "What's it going to take to get a reaction out of you, eh?" The situation was escalating quickly. Thomas could feel the tension building, but his training kept him focused. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family and uphold the dignity of his position, no matter what challenges he faced. James began walking in circles around Thomas, making exaggerated movements and faces at the cameras recording the scene. He was clearly enjoying the attention, even though most of the crowd was watching in disapproval rather than amusement. "Look at this," James announced to his audience. "The perfect British soldier. Stands perfectly still while his country falls apart around him. What a hero!" An older British gentleman in the crowd stepped forward. "Young man, you need to stop this nonsense immediately. Show some respect for our servicemen." James turned his attention to the older man, his face red with anger and alcohol. "Respect? For what? Standing around in a funny hat? My grandfather fought in World War II for this country. This is just pageantry for tourists like you." The confrontation was drawing even more attention. The police officer was still pushing through the crowd, calling for backup on his radio. Thomas could hear the approaching sirens in the distance, but they seemed impossibly far away. James's behavior was becoming more erratic by the minute. He began making faces directly at Thomas, trying to get the guard to laugh or react in some way. When that failed, he started making loud noises, clapping his hands near Thomas's ears, and even jumping up and down like a child having a tantrum. The crowd was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the scene. Parents were covering their children's eyes and moving away from the area. Several tourists had stopped recording, feeling that they were witnessing something that crossed the line from entertainment into harassment. Thomas remained motionless throughout the entire ordeal. His mental discipline was being tested to its absolute limit, but he refused to break. Every fiber of his being wanted to tell the drunk tourist to leave him alone, but his duty came first. James was running out of ideas and growing more frustrated by the second. The alcohol was making him increasingly aggressive, and the lack of response from Thomas was driving him to consider more extreme measures. He looked down at the empty beer bottle in his hand and felt a dangerous thought enter his mind. The crowd sensed that something terrible was about to happen. Several people began shouting for security, while others tried to move closer to intervene. But James was beyond reasoning at this point, his judgment completely clouded by alcohol and embarrassment. What happened next would shock everyone present and change both men's lives forever. The empty beer bottle felt heavy in James's hand as he raised it above his head, his face twisted with rage and intoxication. Thomas, still maintaining his perfect posture, could see what was coming, but remained committed to his duty until the very last second. The crowd held its breath as James's arm reached its highest point, the bottle glinting in the afternoon sun. Time seemed to slow down as everyone realized they were about to witness something that would cross every line of acceptable behavior. Security officers were running toward the scene now, but they were still too far away to prevent what was about to happen. Thomas had seconds to decide how to respond to the imminent attack while maintaining his responsibilities as a royal guard. The moment that would shock the world was about to unfold in front of dozens of cameras and witnesses, creating a story that would be talked about for years to come. The Royal Sentinel Incident, second part. The beer bottle came down hard against Thomas's left temple with a sickening crack that echoed through the courtyard. The crowd gasped in horror as the guard staggered slightly, blood immediately beginning to trickle down his face from where the glass had made contact. For a moment, everyone froze, unable to process what they had just witnessed. James stood there with the broken bottle still in his hand, suddenly realizing the gravity of what he had done. The alcohol-induced bravado evaporated instantly as he saw the blood running down the guard's face. His hands began shaking as the reality of his actions hit him like a cold slap. Thomas felt the sharp pain explode across his skull, and his vision blurred momentarily. Every instinct screamed at him to retaliate, to defend himself against his attacker. The military training that had been drilled into him for years urged him to neutralize the threat immediately. But something deeper, something that spoke to his character as a man and a soldier, held him in place. Instead of striking back or even moving to defend himself, Thomas did something that no one in the crowd expected. Despite the blood flowing down his face and the throbbing pain in his head, he slowly and deliberately reached into his jacket pocket. The crowd watched in stunned silence, many expecting him to pull out a weapon or call for immediate backup. What Thomas retrieved instead was a simple white handkerchief, embroidered with his regimental insignia. With careful, measured movements that demonstrated incredible self-control, he dabbed at the blood on his temple while maintaining his perfect military posture. His eyes never left their forward position, and his expression remained completely neutral despite the assault he had just endured. The crowd was absolutely speechless. Many had their phones recording, but they lowered them instinctively, feeling they were witnessing something sacred rather than scandalous. The Japanese family that had moved away earlier had stopped and turned back, their children wide-eyed with amazement at the guard's composure. James dropped the broken bottle, and it shattered completely on the cobblestones. The sound snapped everyone back to reality. He looked around at the horrified faces surrounding him, finally understanding that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His friend Alex was staring at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. "James, what have you done?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. The police officers who had been pushing through the crowd finally reached the scene. Constable Sarah Rodriguez, a 5-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, immediately assessed the situation. She could see the blood on Thomas's face, the broken glass on the ground, and James standing there looking completely lost. "Nobody move," she commanded in a voice that carried absolute authority. "I need everyone to step back and give us some space." But what happened next surprised even the experienced police officer. Thomas, still standing perfectly at attention despite his injury, made a subtle gesture with his free hand. It was barely perceptible, but Constable Rodriguez recognized it immediately as a military signal indicating that the situation was under control and that he did not require immediate assistance. Thomas then did something that would be talked about in police stations, military barracks, and living rooms across the country for months to come. He looked directly at James for the first time, making eye contact with the young man who had just assaulted him. But instead of anger or hatred, Thomas's eyes showed something completely unexpected. Compassion. "Son," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady and clear despite his injury, "you look like you need help more than punishment." James burst into tears. The combination of alcohol, shame, and the guard's unexpected kindness broke down every defense he had left. He collapsed to his knees on the cobblestones, sobbing uncontrollably as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The crowd began to murmur in amazement. Several people were crying as they witnessed this extraordinary display of grace under pressure. An elderly veteran in the crowd removed his cap and placed it over his heart, recognizing the profound dignity that Thomas was showing in an impossible situation. Constable Rodriguez approached Thomas carefully. "Guardsman, you need medical attention. That's a significant head wound, and you could have a concussion." Thomas nodded slightly, acknowledging her concern while maintaining his military bearing. "I appreciate your concern, Constable, but I believe my duty requires me to remain at my post until my replacement arrives." The police officer was amazed by his dedication, but insisted that his health took priority. "Sir, I'm going to have to override that. You've been assaulted and you need medical care immediately." It was then that something truly magical happened in the crowd. An elderly man stepped forward, his movements careful but determined. He was wearing a military medal on his jacket lapel, indicating his service in past conflicts. "Guardsman," the old veteran said with tears in his eyes, "I served in the Coldstream Guards 40 years ago. Would you permit me to stand watch in your place until your replacement arrives?" Thomas looked at the older man with surprise and deep respect. Military tradition was being honored in the most unexpected way. He nodded slowly, understanding that this veteran's offer was not just a gesture, but a sacred passing of responsibility between soldiers separated by generations. The crowd watched in reverent silence as the elderly veteran took position next to Thomas's post. His posture was not as perfect as the active guardsman's, but his dignity and respect for the tradition were unmistakable. Several other veterans in the crowd stepped forward, creating an informal honor guard around the post. James was still on his knees, overwhelmed by the kindness he was witnessing, despite his terrible behavior. Alex knelt beside his friend, finally understanding that this moment was about much more than a drunken mistake. It was about character, forgiveness, and the power of choosing grace over revenge. Constable Rodriguez gently helped Thomas step away from his post so that the paramedics who had just arrived could examine his wound. As they cleaned the cut and checked for signs of concussion, Thomas kept his eyes on the elderly veteran who had taken his place. "What's your name, sir?" Thomas asked the old soldier. "William Chen," the veteran replied without moving from his position. "I stood at this very post in 1984 during the Queen's Silver Jubilee celebrations." The crowd was growing larger as word of the incident spread, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of the voyeuristic excitement that had characterized the earlier confrontation, there was now a sense of witness to something profound and moving. A young mother in the crowd approached Constable Rodriguez. "Officer, I recorded the whole thing. I want to make sure this guardsman receives recognition for how he handled this situation." Several other tourists echoed her sentiment, offering their recordings as evidence not just of the assault, but of the extraordinary response that followed. Social media was already buzzing with posts about the incident, but unlike typical viral videos of conflict, these posts were filled with admiration and respect. The paramedic examining Thomas determined that while his wound required stitches, he had not suffered a serious concussion. "You're very lucky," she told him. "A few inches to the right, and this could have been much worse." Thomas nodded gratefully, but seemed more concerned about James than about his own injury. He looked over at the young man, who was now sitting on a bench with his head in his hands, still accompanied by his loyal friend Alex. "Constable Rodriguez," Thomas said quietly, "I'd like to speak with the young man who did this, if that's possible." The police officer was surprised by the request. "Sir, I have to advise against that. He's being arrested for assault, and anything said could complicate the legal proceedings." The Royal Sentinel Incident, third part. Against all protocol and the advice of the police officers, Thomas walked slowly toward James, who was still sitting on the bench with his head buried in his hands. The crowd watched in absolute silence as the injured guardsman approached his attacker with measured, dignified steps. "Young man," Thomas said gently, causing James to look up with red, tear-stained eyes. "What's your name?" "James," he whispered, barely able to meet Thomas's gaze. "James Mitchell. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I've never done anything like this before." Thomas studied the young man's face carefully. Years of military service had taught him to read people quickly and accurately. What he saw was not malice or evil, but a confused and troubled young person who had made a terrible mistake while under the influence of alcohol. "James," Thomas said, sitting down on the bench beside him, much to the amazement of everyone watching. "I want you to know that I forgive you for what happened here today." James broke down completely at these words, sobbing so hard that his entire body shook. "How can you forgive me? I hit you with a bottle. I hurt you for no reason. I deserve to go to prison." Thomas placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Everyone deserves a second chance, James, but forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences. It means we choose to respond with love instead of hatred." Constable Rodriguez approached them carefully, still amazed by what she was witnessing. "Guardsman Webb, I need to inform you that Mr. Mitchell is under arrest for assault. Your statement will be crucial for the charges we file." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, then surprised everyone once again with his next words. "Constable, I would like to make a formal request. Instead of pressing charges, I would prefer that James be required to perform community service, specifically helping with veteran support programs. I believe this young man has the potential to make amends for his actions in a more meaningful way than simply serving time in prison." The crowd erupted in whispers of amazement. James looked up at Thomas with complete disbelief, while Alex stared at both of them with his mouth hanging open. You would do that for me?" James stammered. "After what I did to you?" Thomas smiled for the first time since the incident began. "James, I've been a soldier for 8 years. I've seen what hatred and revenge can do to people and communities. I've also seen what forgiveness and redemption can accomplish. Which path do you think serves our country better?" An elderly woman in the crowd began clapping slowly, and soon the entire gathering was applauding. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the reverent clapping of people who had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Constable Rodriguez was faced with an unprecedented situation. While Thomas's wishes would be taken into consideration, the assault was still a serious crime that had occurred in a public place. However, she recognized that this was a teaching moment that could have far-reaching positive effects. "Mr. Mitchell," she said formally, "you're still under arrest. But Guardsman Webb's recommendation will be noted in my report. The magistrate will make the final decision about your sentencing." James stood up slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Guardsman Webb, Thomas, I promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did today. I will never drink again, and I will find a way to honor the kindness you've shown me." Thomas extended his hand to James, and they shook hands solemnly, while cameras recorded the moment from every angle. What had started as an assault had transformed into a powerful lesson about forgiveness, redemption, and the strength that comes from choosing compassion over retribution. The elderly veteran, William Chen, was still standing at Thomas's post with perfect military bearing. As Thomas returned to relieve him, the old soldier saluted crisply. "It has been an honor to serve alongside you today, Guardsman Webb," William said with genuine emotion. "You have upheld the finest traditions of our regiment and our nation." Thomas returned the salute with equal respect. "The honor has been mine, sir. Thank you for maintaining our watch." As James was led away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time to look at Thomas. "I will make you proud," he called out. "I promise." The crowd began to disperse slowly, but many people approached Thomas to express their admiration for his handling of the situation. Tourists from around the world shook his hand and took photos with him, but the atmosphere was completely different from the earlier spectacle. There was genuine respect and reverence now. A reporter from the BBC who had arrived during the incident approached Thomas for an interview. "Guardsman Webb, your response to this assault has been extraordinary. What made you choose forgiveness over pressing for the maximum punishment?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "Ma'am, I took an oath to serve and protect. That doesn't just mean standing guard at a palace. It means protecting the values that make our society worth defending. Forgiveness, redemption, and second chances are British values just as much as justice and order." The reporter pressed further. "But don't you think your response might encourage others to behave badly? knowing they won't face serious consequences? On the contrary, Thomas replied thoughtfully, I think most people were far more moved by seeing forgiveness in action than they would have been by seeing someone punished. James Mitchell was transformed by experiencing grace. Punishment alone rarely changes hearts. The interview was broadcast that evening and quickly went viral around the world. Forgiveness, inaction, and true strength began trending on social media as people shared the story and reflected on their own capacity for grace and mercy. 3 months later, James Mitchell stood before a magistrate for his sentencing hearing. He had completed 30 days of community service at a veterans shelter and had been sober since the day of the incident. Character references came from the shelter director, his university professors, and most remarkably, from Thomas Webb himself. Your Honor, the magistrate announced, this is one of the most unusual cases I have encountered in 20 years on the bench. While the assault was serious and cannot be excused, the response of the victim and the transformation of the defendant present us with a unique opportunity for restorative justice. James was sentenced to 6 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service with veterans organizations, and mandatory alcohol counseling. He was also required to speak at schools and universities about the consequences of excessive drinking and the power of forgiveness. Thomas attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery with James's parents, who had flown down from Manchester. When the sentence was announced, both men nodded to each other with mutual respect. Outside the courthouse, James approached Thomas one final time. I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You saved my life that day. Thomas smiled warmly. James, you saved your own life by choosing to learn from your mistake. I just provided the opportunity. 6 months later, James graduated from university with honors and was accepted into a master's program in social work, specializing in addiction counseling. His senior thesis was titled The Transformative Power of Radical Forgiveness, A Personal Journey. Thomas continued his service with the Coldstream Guards, but his story had made him a symbol of the best qualities of British military service. He was promoted to Lance Corporal and became a sought-after speaker at military academies and leadership conferences around the world. The two men maintained a friendship that would last for years to come. Every year, on the anniversary of their first meeting, they would meet for coffee near Buckingham Palace and reflect on how a moment of terrible judgment had been transformed into a lifelong lesson about the power of choosing grace over revenge. The elderly veteran William Chen was invited to attend the annual Trooping the Color ceremony as a guest of honor, recognizing his spontaneous service that day. He and Thomas corresponded regularly, sharing stories and wisdom across generations of military service. The incident became a case study in conflict resolution programs around the world, demonstrating how individual choices to respond with compassion rather than anger can create ripple effects that extend far beyond the original situation. Years later, when people asked Thomas about that day, he would always say the same thing. I learned that day that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit back. It's about how you can transform a moment of darkness into an opportunity for light. James, now a successful addiction counselor helping young people struggling with alcohol abuse, would tell his clients, "One moment of poor judgment nearly destroyed my life, but one man's choice to forgive me gave me the chance to rebuild it. That's the difference between justice and mercy, and it's the difference between punishment and redemption." The story of their encounter continued to inspire people around the world, proving that even in moments of violence and hatred, the human capacity for forgiveness and transformation can create miracles that no one could have imagined. I understand, Thomas replied, but I think this might be an opportunity to turn something terrible into something positive. What Thomas was about to do would not only shock the crowd further, but would also challenge everything people thought they knew about justice, forgiveness, and the true meaning of strength. His next actions would create ripples that would extend far beyond that sunny afternoon in London.